Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Michael Yardney podcast. In today's show, my guest Mike Mortlock and I explore the patterns and trends of property investment, how far away from home people actually invest. We also look at the latest data from the Australian Taxation Office and what it tells us about the landscape of property ownership. If you've ever wondered how many Australians actually own investment properties or how much they earn, you're going to enjoy my chat with Mike. But we're not going to stop there. We'll be delving into a crucial aspect of property investment that sometimes goes misunderstood: depreciation. Many property investors make common mistakes when it comes to depreciation. We're here to help you steer clear of those. So if you're eager to enhance your property investment knowledge, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
How do you decide where to invest in property? We know there are multiple property markets around Australia, and anecdotally, a lot of investors, they buy in their own backyard, in their comfort zone. But what's really happening out there? My guest today, Mike Mortlock, Director of MCG Quantity Surveyors, tracked this during and pre and after COVID, and he came up with a number of very interesting thoughts. Now, Mike's worked with thousands of property investors to help them maximise their depreciation benefits, so I also want to take the opportunity to ask him about some of the mistakes he's seen investors make so you can avoid them. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
Yes, it's been a little while, and I enjoy listening to your podcast with the Property Trio. So you accompanying me on my walks with Lincoln in the mornings on a Monday. And I saw that you've done a little bit of research about where investors are buying, and the fact that you operate your depreciation company, MCG Quantity Surveyors, nationally gives you great insights into that. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, look, what I am is a bit of a closet big data nerd. In fact, I'm probably well out of the closet now, right? So as you say, by virtue of doing tax depreciation schedules for investors across the country, we ask some questions in and around that, things like, have they ever lived in the property? And if they have, when did they move out? So we have access to data that not everybody has. And one thing that we ask, of course, is where did you buy your investment property and where do you actually live? So what I was really interested in is how far people invest from where they live, because there's always that pervasive notion that investors aren't sophisticated and they buy around the corner. That was my first motivation, right? And then when the pandemic happened, I wanted to see, have we seen a really functional shift in the way that we invest?
And what did you find?
Well, I found that the old sort of idea that investors were pretty unsophisticated was probably smashed by the average distance being 293 kilometres from where they live.
Now, that was pre-COVID.
That was pre-COVID, yeah.
Okay, so where does that put you? In the same state but further away? I guess it's an average, isn't it? So yeah. Some are in other states and some are nearby and it evens out. Yeah,
another way to probably look at it is that 60% of people were buying within 50 kilometres and only 29.5% were buying more than 200 kilometres. So I think maybe in and around 200 kilometres is where they might physically inspect the property. I think that's a fair assumption, right? You would maybe drive, an hour or two to go and look at an investment property, but maybe after that, that's a barrier. But we also found that 10.8% of people bought within 2 kilometres from where they live, and 23.2% bought within 5 kilometres of where they live. So I suppose it's up to the journalist to tell whichever story that they want.
Now, Mike, a couple of years ago, I read a report. It was run by two universities, one in Tasmania and one in New South Wales, where they actually studied the success of people who bought in their own backyard. And it was counterintuitive. It actually showed that the ongoing long-term success of property investment of people who bought in their own backyard, and they judged that by capital growth and whether they were happy with the return on their investments, was actually underperformed people who bought further away. In other words, that intuitive thought that, hey, I know it's a bargain, I know it's in my area, I know it's a good investment, actually isn't true.
Yeah. Another way to think of it is, what is the probability that you happen to live in the best investment location
That's
available
a good one.
to you?
Yes, yes,
Right?
yes.
The probability is very, very small. And when you sort of say to people, well, why did you buy around the corner from where you live? They'll say, oh, well, I know the good areas and I know the school zones and the coffee shops. But you ask them, well, do you know the main employers? Do you know the breakup of owner-occupiers versus renters? Do you know the median household incomes? That's not the sort of stuff that they understand. But, everyone's kind of afraid of having to have a $200 or $300 light bulb bill because they can't go and fix it themselves. But if your growth rate is 7% as opposed to 4% per year, you can afford to pay $10,000 for that light bulb to be changed and still better off, right?
Definitely. So that was pre-COVID. What happened afterwards?
Well, during COVID, we saw that number explode to 599 kilometres. So I really want to hear your thoughts on what pushed that change. I mean, obviously in the lockdowns, we couldn't really go and inspect property. Real estate agents could have, one-on-one inspections or inspect vacant properties. But I think we had more time at home. We had more time to research. There's been an increase in the availability of buyers agents who do the hot spotting around the country and those sorts of things. And I just think by virtue of us being a little bit more online, we all embraced Zoom. I wish I got shares in Zoom during the pandemic. We just accepted that, okay, well, technology is there and we can actually look at properties and do a level of due diligence on properties.
Remember the days of the
country.
virtual walkthroughs because you couldn't go through. So the estate agents let you see it online.
Yeah, exactly. So what did you see, Michael? What do you think's driving that?
I believe that the concept of a borderless investor has been made more common by a number of good commentators and some other good podcasts as well, and people realised they didn't have to invest in their own backyard. I think people living in Melbourne were very nervous about investing as we were locked down for 260 days. I think the concept that in Western Australia you couldn't even get in. One of the problems, of course, investing at a distance is getting somebody proper to look at it. And as you made a comment a moment ago, there's lots of buyers agents who are prepared to help you invest interstate. My real concern is that they don't even go and inspect the property. At a recent wealth retreat, one of the participants was a significant person in the real estate industry in Perth, runs a very big property management business, and he was telling me how many buyers agents this year have been buying in Perth and the eastern suburbs and ringing him up and say, hey, can your property managers go out and look at a property for me? Because they don't or can't be bothered going there. The problem is a property manager will tell you what's rentable and what the rent is, but they don't know what an investment grade property is. So, sorry, I went on a rant but I didn't answer your question why it's happening. What I'm saying is I'm concerned it's happening more. I'm not concerned it's happening. I don't think we should invest in our own backyards. I think there's opportunities everywhere, but just be careful how you do it.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? I know that you're sort of a property data meritocracist. Gee, that was a mouthful.
I have never heard that word in my 70 years of life. What does it mean?
There you go. Well, I think just in terms of you purchasing an investment property on its merit, right? It's about the data. It's not about the location per se. It's about all of the drivers and everything that you believe about the growth of property.
Okay, let's be clear. It's more than just data. It's a combination of art and science. So the data is very important, but you also need the perspective because you can make data say almost anything, can't you, Mike?
Yeah, well, I just referenced that before with, the journalists can make whatever story that they want. And I think that's true. But I agree with you. It's a double-edged sword. The ability for an investor to be on the East Coast and then go and purchase in somewhere in and around Perth and, have some great results, that is great. But my preference is always for that buyer's agent to be physically inspecting that property.
Sure. So the last property Pam and I purchased was in Brisbane, and we didn't see it. One of my team at Metropole did, and I saw all the photos and saw everything. And he was on the ground, and he's been a selling agent in the past, so he knew the area. He knew why, gave me lots of data, but also gave me the demographics and future changes. So I think demographics is another important factor in why some areas outperform more than others. But yeah, no issue with buying outside your backyard, not in your backyard, I guess, and not seeing the property as long as somebody on your behalf is. So during COVID, it happened more. And what's happened since? I mean, last year, it was a funny year, wasn't it? The market slumped, depending upon who you listen to, up to about 9%. And this year, things have improved and people are back buying again. Not in droves, but they're definitely out there. So what has your latest data shown, Mike?
We actually saw that number jump from, it started 293 to 599 during COVID, all the way up to 857 kilometres. So the trend, I think, is here to stay. People are looking for opportunities across the country. That's a huge average. It's a lot higher than what I expect it to be. We talked a little bit off air about the sort of resurgence of Perth as a property investing hotspot. Now, Perth is so bloody far away, if I'm allowed to say that it's going to blow out the numbers, right? And Perth is having a bit of a renaissance at the moment, but it's not going to last forever. So I expect that number to come back to be somewhere between that sort of 600 and 800 kilometre mark.
Well, I see your chart at the moment, and interestingly, the number of people investing in the same suburb hasn't changed statistically significantly. It's still about 6% of people. So there's always some people who are going to invest in their own backyard, but those who invested really nearby, so if you're in Melbourne, you wouldn't necessarily go to Ballarat or Geelong. You would consider going to Brisbane. Much the same in Queensland and New South Wales. Maybe you wouldn't go to Newcastle or Wollongong or the Central Coast, a couple of 100 kilometres away. That seems to have shrunk a bit and people are prepared to cross the border.
Yeah, I think so. And the level of education is much more sophisticated than what it has been, I think. And, you've been doing your thing for quite some time. I think people are embracing property data, property research. It's becoming a little bit more sophisticated than the barbecue chat about, Uncle Terry bought an investment property, you should get one too. Now it's like, I hear Townsville's booming, what's going on there? There is a bit more sophisticated conversation going on about it, and there's much more education available despite, you being in the game for a long time. There was a long time where it was sort of seemingly only you, right? But now there's all sorts of voices out there with differing opinions and different suggestions on where to be going.
Well, that's the problem. There's lots of opinions. Everyone's allowed an opinion, but you don't necessarily have to take their advice. Now, I also heard you recently speak about the number of people who are investing in property. And if you read the media, it's ugly, greedy landlords with huge portfolios taking advantage of poor tenants, slum landlords. But the ATO released figures recently about how many investors there are, what they earn, how many investment properties they own. And that's not really the picture of the typical Australian landlord, is it?
Yeah. And I think, not the last election, but the previous two before that, we had a lot of rhetoric around the standard property investor being, the landed gentry. But the data, again, is basically reinforcing that notion that most property investors really have only one property. We're only talking around about 72% of property investors own one property. That's refreshing to see that the story is a little bit of a beat up. Of course, there are people that own 6 or more properties, but you're talking less than 1% of property investors. Of the 2.3 million property investors, there's something like 19,000 people that own 6 or more properties. So they are out there, but it's not as dire as many people would suggest.
I guess there's a couple of ways of looking at that. Firstly, it shows that the average Australian property investor is looking after their future. They're taking a commercial risk. They're taking a loan. There's all these uncertainties. And at the moment, they're seeing government interfering more, the banks making it harder, land tax going up, insurance going up. And I know some are wondering, is it worth it all? And yes, they're putting up rents, Mike, but rents haven't kept up with inflation over the last decade, and it's really only this last year that rents have gone up double-digit growth, but they still haven't equaled, if you even them out over the decade, inflation yet. Yet, unfortunately, we're hearing scary talks about rental freezes or land tax changes. I want to ask you about that in a moment. But before we get on to that, let's just have a look at how many investment properties people own. And as you said, less than around 20,000 own 6 or more properties. Mike, can I show off?
Yeah.
So we keep track of the data from the Australian Taxation Office, which is actually retrospective. I think the last year was, what was it, 1920.
Yeah, it's always a number of years behind.
Yes. But we actually did a audit of the results of our clients at Metropole, and we found that our clients were 7.3 times more likely to be in that top 1% of investors own 6 or more properties. And I'd like to think that they got into that position because they made the right decisions, because they got the right advice. So just because only a small group actually achieve that, I think the message I'd like to give people is you don't have to be greedy. It's not that at all. But if you're wanting to secure your financial future and that for future generations, if somebody else can do it, there's no reason why you can't. There's a formula. The trouble is people keep coming up with new ideas as opposed to sticking to the fundamentals. I think my way of investing is too simple for smart people.
Well, you look at property journalism. The best ideas are often very, very simple, but that's not going to get you in the newspaper, right? You've got to come up with all these crazy ways of getting 30 properties in 30 years, or here's the property that I bought for 100,000, I'm selling it for 10 million because I found opal, or I did an 8-story high rise. You know, you're right. And what's interesting is getting back to that figure, and it's 71.5% of investors only own one property. The number hasn't really moved that much. It's been sitting in the low 70s as long as I've been watching it, and that just says to me that people are still not getting that first investment property right.
That's interesting, because despite the blogs, despite the podcasts, despite all the webinars, it hasn't changed much. So I can make a forecast now. There's not very few property forecasts I'm prepared to make, but I bet you when we talk about this in 10 years' time, still about 1% of investors are going to own 6 or more properties, and 99% will only own 1 to 5. And interestingly, the other statistic that's left out of this, but if you look at CoreLogic's Pain and Gain report and others, 50% of people who get into property sell up in the first 5 years. So they get it wrong. So all the extra information hasn't helped, has it?
No, it hasn't. And in some respects, I sort of think when I'm doing a podcast, the mission is kind of to help move the needle on that figure. I would like the average person to own 2 investment properties, because I think, yes, of course, you can own one $10 million commercial property and that will be enough, but the average person's not doing that. They're owning a 600,000 odd property, and it's arguably nowhere near enough to prepare them for the retirement that they would like to have. So I think, you know, more than one property is a good goalpost for people like us to try and, you know, have as something that they want to move the needle on.
Sure. So I know you also had a look at the tax statistics of what the average Australian earns, and it was a bit less than I expected.
Yeah. So the average taxable income in the 2019-2020 year was 63,882. So that's 74.5 roughly for males and 52,798 for female. So it's gone up from 62.5 to 63,800. So that's not meeting inflation. But yeah, that is a bit lower than what I expected.
Oh, the other interesting statistic that came out of all this is the percentage of Australians who are property investors has fallen over time, hasn't it?
Yeah, and that came as a surprise to me as well, right? Because, you know, you've only got to go on Facebook and see all of the chatter in and around property and property investing. You know, there's forums with 30,000+ people that are having, you know, what seemingly hundreds of posts a day. There seems to be a huge interest in property, but yeah, the numbers aren't really bearing that out. But who's to say whether that's just a function of the economic times we're in at the moment, right? We were talking again off air about price point being a driver for certain locations, and as we've seen interest rates rise, you know, the borrowing power hasn't been there, and there's fewer and fewer pockets of the country where you can get investment grade stock for under $600,000.
Very much so. So one of the things is price point, but I think at the moment a lot of investors are nervous about government interference. Now, earlier this year, the Queensland government proposed some land tax changes, which meant that if you owned an investment property in other states, you'd actually pay a higher land tax in Queensland. That was repealed for various reasons. I don't think the other states were prepared to help the Queensland government with that. We know recently Victoria's changed the land tax rules as well. Now, land tax is a terrible tax. In my mind, it's a wealth tax. I think the only advantage of it is that it's tax deductible, but it scares people off. Now, I know you did some homework, some research to see the effect of government interference and proposed land tax changes. What did you come up with?
We did. I had a bit of a thought experiment because we've always tracked the locations around a country on a state-by-state basis where investors are favouring. And, the last time I reported on it, Queensland was sitting at around about 34% of purchases as distinct from other states, with Victoria at around about 11 and New South Wales somewhere in the middle. But we actually saw the state of Queensland peak prior to the land tax changes at 40.9%. So hyper popular destination for a number of different reasons. But what we then looked at is, okay, well, the land tax legislation in Queensland was legislated. Yes, it was repealed. It was due to come out the 1st of July this year. But there was about 98 days where this was the law and it would impact investors in starting the 1st of July. So we wanted to see if the anecdotal things that we were hearing from property investors and buyers agents that people are avoiding Queensland were actually borne out in the data. And what we actually saw is that that prior to the legislation change, 40.9% of people were buying in Queensland, and that plummeted to 33.6%, which works out to be about 14.7% drop in purchases in Queensland during that time.
And you believe it's related, you can't ask the question, to land tax changes or the implication that it was coming in. To be honest, if I was deciding then, my last property purchase was in Queensland, and because I'd purchased it in the right entity where I wouldn't get myself into trouble, not that I knew this was coming, this law didn't personally affect me. But if I was thinking about it, it would definitely be in my consideration. Where should I be investing?
I think it was a consideration for people. And why I think, whilst we're not talking a sample size in the thousands, we're talking in the hundreds. So I like to talk at sample sizes of 1,000 or more because of the statistical robustness. But, in 98 days, we could only do so many depreciation schedules in Queensland, right? But we did index that in percentage terms. So people were saying, are people just not buying as much in Queensland because they're not buying as much at all because interest rates have gone up? Well, we were just looking at flat percentage, Queensland versus New South Wales versus Victoria. So that made me feel that there was an extra level of robustness to it. People were enamoured by Queensland, and during that period it dropped 14.7% and it rebounded marginally. It went back up from 33.6 to 34.73. And that's another story in itself. Why did it not rebound back to where it was? But I think there's enough in that data to at least see anecdotal and data evidence, qualitative and quantitative. And I think there's enough to say that investors did exit that market.
I think there's a lesson for our governments and particular political parties, and I won't mention names and colours, that be careful what you're trying to do. So I understand that there are people concerned about tenants, and I believe it's the government responsibility to provide social housing for the disenfranchised. There's always going to be disenfranchised people in Australia, and that's what you and I pay our taxes for. But the government's not providing the large level of property accommodation for a third of Australians who rent. That's just the way they've chosen to do things. So therefore, I think the real shortage of rental properties is only going to get worse as the government's now scaring investors off. And I think this is a good example of this. Stop talking about rental freezes. Stop talking about land tax changes. Stop using Australian property investors as an ATM. Instead, encourage us because we're providing a good service, Mike.
Yeah, I think if you're a policymaker and you just hate property investors for whatever reason, and your plan is to build a social housing network or to sponsor build to rent to take the place of them, even if all that is true, it's a long time frame to do that, right? You can't revolutionize the housing accommodation for renters in a 6-month time frame. We're probably talking decades rather than years. So right now, all you've got is mum and dad investors that are providing the vast majority of rental accommodation. And it begs the question, were they trying to solve the rental affordability crisis? Because if they were, they failed miserably. If it was just a Queensland government tax grab, then that's another conversation.
Yeah, you really wonder about that, because I don't really think they're as silly as all that. But do they really want to solve the rental affordability crisis or the housing crisis? Now, Mike, I'd like to ask you some thoughts about depreciation, because since I've got you on the show and haven't had you for a while, I think it's important. Now, quick disclaimer, you've recently provided a depreciation schedule for me. We use MCG quantity surveyors. We never get any kickbacks or commissions from you, so that's not the reason I've got you on the show. In fact, I believe I paid for my last depreciation schedule. I hope you gave me a discount, mate. What I'd like to know is some of the mistakes you see investors make with regard to depreciation, because I remember reading that you thought billions with a B of dollars of tax deductions are being left on the table.
And I like to joke about who's paying for these new submarines, and I've actually found that it's probably property investors who are leaving tax deductions on the table. That is one of the biggest mistakes I see.
So why? What are they doing wrong?
Well, what we looked at is we took a sample of 1,000 residential property investors, and we figured out how long it took them to get in touch with us from the date they purchased the property. And people might know that you can backclaim 2 financial years worth of deductions. Your accountant will probably charge you an amendment fee, so it's not a great idea to do, but you've got that safety net, right? So what we found is that 6.7% of people actually waited more than those 2 years to get in touch with us. Now, 6.7% doesn't sound like a lot, but those are the people that eventually found us. We think that there's probably a lot more people out there that just don't even realise. And what we found is that the average deductions that person missed out on was 20,537. Now, this is an audio format, and you can't tell that I'm not looking at a piece of paper, but I remember that because it's burnt into my head, because those sorts of things keep me up at night. Investors should be claiming the deductions that they're entitled to, and an average of $20,537, you extrapolate that across 6.7% of, say, the property investor population. That's where we came with the figure of $2.88 billion worth of unclaimed depreciation deductions floating out there in the ether for property investors.
That's a lot.
That's at least a propeller.
So one of the mistakes is not understanding that their properties have got eligible deductions, because I know that the rules changed a while ago, and I think some people think it's a new property, of course I can claim depreciation. Oh, it's an established apartment or house, I can't. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. The old idea used to be, okay, it's an old property, there's not going to be any depreciation. So the problem that we had there is we needed to educate people, well, if it's been renovated or improved, which most properties built prior to the cutoff date for depreciation on the structure will have been, then there will be deductions. But certainly the legislation changed on the 9th of May 2017 that basically said, unless you are buying a brand new property or you're installing a brand new asset, you can't claim the plant and equipment items. And they're things like carpets and blinds and ovens and hot water systems. So people often will think, okay, it's not a brand new property, it's not worthwhile for depreciation. But if it's constructed after the 16th of September 1987, you'll get the bones of the building, the structure, which represents the majority of the value, right? If you've got a $330,000 cost to build a house, around 300 of it would be the structure, and you get 2.5% of that each financial year. So we're talking about $7,500 worth of deductions a year.
Now, one of the other concerns, and we had a recent podcast with Ken Race explaining what the tax department's looking for. The tax department's wanting to make sure that you don't claim repairs for things that aren't repairs, but that are improvements and must then be depreciated over time. Is there an easy way for investors to understand what can I claim today in this financial year, or what do I have to depreciate over a period of time?
Yeah, and big shout out to Ken. He's a legend in the industry, in the accounting space. Yes, there is an easy way to do it. You need to consider, are you replacing an item or are you fixing something that remains in place? So if you are doing repairs and maintenance, that means that the asset or the item is just being fixed up back to fit to purpose or functional, right? And that's the best type of deduction because it's an immediate deduction. If it costs you $2,500, then it's a $2,500 deduction in the year that cost was incurred. Now, if you have, let's say, a hot water system, and rather than repairing a widget that keeps it going, you're actually replacing it like for like, that's not a repair, that's not maintenance. It's a new asset that needs to be depreciated over its effective life, which is going to be 12 or 15 years, depending on the type of asset. So the tax office does want to look at people trying to claim an immediate deduction when it should be depreciated over the life of the asset.
Now, I've heard it say by some people, hey, if I sell my property, I've got to give back the depreciation allowance I've received. In fact, some people don't even know that happens, and they think, oh, I'm selling my property for $800,000, going to pay some capital gains tax. They don't realise that they've also got to give back something in their capital base. My point would be slightly different. I'd rather take the tax deduction now, today. First of all, I don't want to sell a property, and I'd rather have it today, and who knows what the tax rate's going to be or what I'm going to claim in the future.
It's a good thing to bring up and a great question, but it's often always a question that's sort of almost heckled at me at the end of a presentation because it's like, oh, well, that's all very well, Mr. Depreciation, but I've just got to pay it back anyway, so what's the point? But that's not exactly how it works. Let's say you buy a property for $100,000. Good luck to you. You sell it for $200,000, a year or so later. You've made $100,000 capital gain. Now, over that year, if you've claimed, say, $10,000 worth of structural improvements, then your cost base will reduce by that amount. So it means that you're looking at a $90,000 cost base and you're selling for $200,000. So it's $110,000 capital gain. Now, the depreciation that you're paying back is really just on the structural items rather than the plant and equipment items. Technically, they'll never find their way into the contract. If you're holding that property in your personal name for more than 12 months, you get a 50% exemption. So it's now gone from $110,000 to $55,000. And then it's taxed at your marginal rate. And if you're on a higher marginal rate of tax, that can almost be cut in half again. It might have now gone down to $20,000. So you're not paying it all back. You can get the exemptions. It's then at your marginal rate. And like the point that you made is that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. So getting that deduction now, rather than looking at repaying that in 10, 20, 30 years' time. I mean, you look at inflation at the moment, $1 today is going to be a hell of a lot more valuable than it is in 20 or 30 years.
Oh, very much so. Okay, what would you say to somebody who said, oh, my accountant will do it. I've given him the numbers, I've given him the figures. My accountant says he can do my depreciation schedule.
You've got to be very careful, and accountants are clever people. They're experts in what they do, but what they can't do, they're not qualified to do, is estimate construction cost. So let's say you put a split system into your investment property. You'll have an invoice, you'll have the date that it was done. Your accountant can look up the taxation rate and put that into your depreciation schedule. But when you buy a property, you might, let's say you pay $1 million for a property. It doesn't say you've bought $650,000 worth of structural improvements. It doesn't say that the previous owner did a bathroom renovation and that was worth $42,000 of Division 43 assets. That's where the construction cost needs to be estimated by an expert. And if your accountant is doing it, they shouldn't be doing that. But if they are, they're more likely to be conservative because they don't want to be audited. So they might just go, look, if I plug this figure in, the ATO aren't going to touch it because if they challenge me on it, I'll get a quantity survey and it'll probably go up.
Sure. Well, if you go back in history, quantity surveyors' jobs were to survey quantities, decide how much it costs to build a building. And I know that's still part of what you do. You work with builders and developers and banks on that. So you understand what the the various costs and components are. And I'm always fascinated when I get the depreciation schedules you do for me and for our clients when we build the new properties. There's all sorts of things that people wouldn't even think about, wiring and all sorts of things that all the little bits add up, don't they?
Yeah, they absolutely do. I mean, you look at the taxation effective lives, they come out each year, and there's about 181 pages of plant and equipment items. And in the commercial space, it gets even weirder. I mean, there's new categories for beekeepers and casino operators and smash repairs businesses that have got their own specific assets. So yeah, there's a lot more than people would think.
Okay, for simple property investors, I guess one of the rules would be keep good records, make it easy for your accountant and for your depreciation consultant to understand where the money has gone, especially since a lot of people currently are doing renovations. So it's also important to get the timing of those right too. If when you first do a renovation, when you buy a property, and people are doing that, they buy it a bit run down and renovate it, you actually can't claim that straight away, can you?
Yeah, so we used to talk about scrapping a lot, where you could look at the plant and equipment items that you're throwing out in the bin and claim the residual value. But because of that legislation change, the plant and equipment items that are previously used have no depreciation benefit for them. But it is very important to capture all of the costs that you have across the lifetime of owning that property. And it's not just depreciation, it's things like property management fees and repairs and maintenance and council rates. But certainly, you always talk about treating it like a business and being the CEO of the property team, right? And, a business is going to have an accountant or a bookkeeper that's keeping these costs, because you need to rely on them. And that's something that every investor should be doing.
Now, I'm actually looking forward to catching up with you shortly, because I know your team at MCG Quantity Surveyors is taken a gold table at our upcoming charity ball. You supported Pam and Metropole last time we had a charity ball, and in August we're running one in Brisbane. So guys, if you're listening to this and you are based in Brisbane, wouldn't it be great to catch up with not just Mike, but me and the Metropole team and a whole lot of clever people. And there's some good celebrities that are actually coming along, Mike, to support. I mean, it's going to be a good, fun night of entertainment and food and loads of fun, but it's actually supporting Hummingbird House. And they provide relief and support for children and their families going through difficult times. Look, to be honest, kids who've got life-threatening illnesses who require 24-hour care. I can't imagine having how one would go through this. It's a challenge no family should ever face alone. So, Mike, I want to thank you and MCG Quantity Surveyors for supporting us, and I look forward to catching up with you and your team there. Now, if people are wondering, hey, should I actually speak to this guy and get a quantity surveying report? How do they understand when is enough? Is it enough? Is it worth actually contacting you, or is it going to cost me more money than I'm going to get back?
Yeah, look, you should contact a quantity surveyor, right? And I'm happy to be that guy.
Well, we'll leave a link in the show notes.
Yeah, thank you. But, if it's not me, you should talk to somebody, and most people will give you free advice to say, look, this is the type of deductions that we would expect to see for your property. And us as a business, we won't complete a report unless we know it's going to be beneficial to the client. We can go and help plenty of people that it's going to be beneficial for. We don't need to try and do anything else. But
hey, it's tax deductible too, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So,
let Anthony Albanese pay for your depreciation schedule.
But the easy way to think about it is there's three triggers that should be alarming you that you need to get a depreciation schedule done. One is you buy a brand new property. For the reasons that we've already discussed, a brand new property will always have great deductions. The second trigger is it's built after the 16th of September 1987, because it'll have depreciation claims on the original structure. The last one, if it doesn't match either of those two conditions, it's an older property, say it's built in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s, we're looking for improvement. So if it's had a renovation or an extension, a kitchen and a bathroom, anywhere above about $50,000 in value, which, used to be a kitchen and bathroom, now it's probably a plumbing quote, a call out fee. 50 grand doesn't go a long way. And if you're not sure, we can have a look at the information online. There's pretty much photos of every property in Australia. We can go and have a look and say, look, this is actually worthwhile. We would recommend it based on these reasons. And then we can go and do the full inspection and the full report.
Well, thank you, Mike Mortlock, CEO and joint founder of MCG Quantity Surveyors. Look forward to having a chat with you again real soon.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Michael.
I hope you enjoyed my chat with Mike Mortlock. And if you did, and you don't currently subscribe to the show, just stop for a sec. I'm going to share my mindset moment with you in a second, but I'd like you to just stop and subscribe or follow this show on whatever podcast app you're listening to so that you can regularly get my information and that of the guests I have twice a week. Now, we spoke a bit about the Australian Taxation Office statistics. Another statistic that came out recently was the ABS statistic showing that Australia added 1,361 people a day in 2022. That means we recorded an increase of 496,800, 500,000 people in 2022. Now, it was mainly immigration, and sure, some of them are going to be short-term tenants. They're going to be students who are here for a while, but it's likely that this extra 500,000 people who are calling Australia home are going to keep underpinning our economic growth, either ease some of the tight job markets, but the sheer weight of numbers is going to offset the negative impact of Australians in general spending less because of all the interest rate rises. You see, these migrants are going to set up new households, and that's going to keep driving demand and fueling our economy. So I'm not worried that our economy is going to slow a little bit. We're not bringing in refugees. Many of these migrants are students and their parents are paying their way. Others are lots of cashed up permanent residents. They tend to rent for a while before they buy a home, so they're not going to feel the pain of high interest rates. The sheer weight of numbers is going to just keep pushing up our property markets. And I'm sure you know it by now that despite all the interest rate rises, the property market turned earlier this year, and this is the beginning of a new cycle. The worst's over and the best's yet to come. So it's time to get your ducks in a row and get set for the opportunities that are going to abound. But be careful. Property investment, you've heard me say it before, is a process, not an event. You can't just buy any property and hope to be successful. So I believe before you buy a property, you've got to formulate a plan and you've got to get the right advice. That's more critical than ever. So why not have a chat with my team at Metropole? Go to metropole.com.au. We always start off by putting a strategic plan together. Sure, we'd love to help you buy a property using our buyer's agent services. We'd love to help you with our wealth advisory, property management, renovations, development services. But first, plan to become the person you plan to become, and then we're going to help you safely create intergenerational wealth through property. metropole.com.au.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
Today in my mindset message, I'd like to share with you a blog that I just recently read from Joe Polish, an American marketer, but it actually made me think, and I'd like you to see how his insights make you look at things in a different way. Because Joe Polish said, I like stress, but I don't like distress. He said, distress will tear you down. Stress, like working out, will make you stronger. You know, I guess he's right. Joe went on to say, I learned early on in my career to do one thing every day that scares you. He said, that means doing something challenging, because through challenge, you become better. And, you know, I guess he's right. There's a saying, life's not happening to you, it's happening for you. Now, interestingly, Joe Polish said one of his best friends, Dr. Sean Stevenson's last words to him before he died from a tragic accident were, this is happening for me, not to me. Well, I think that's a brave way of thinking about it. But I guess what Joe Polish was trying to say is when bad things happen, ask yourself, is this happening to me or for me? Listen, nothing feels good in the middle. You're going in through financial challenges or bankruptcy. Well, that doesn't feel good. You're in the middle of a divorce. Well, boy, that feels terrible. You're in the middle of an illness. Nothing feels good in the middle. So in the middle, it requires a lot of courage. But when you're done, though, you learn from it. You grow from it. Now, unfortunately for Joe Polish's friend Sean, who was passing on, but interestingly, while facing death, he still centered himself. So if you can develop yourself to see things that happen in your life, even the most painful things, as there to help you, that will transform you. All of those things that seem to oppose your goals are actually the raw material for achieving them. Think about that. All the things that come at you that seem to oppose you, to slow you down from reaching your goals, are actually the raw material you need for achieving them. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?